All right. So Steve, you were gone last week, and I put this up, one similar to this last week. The comment you'd made about the Hebrew calendar, and so I thought it's kind of cool, so I put it up last week, and so I updated it for today. That's today in the Hebrew calendar. So he had made, if you remember, Steve had made the comment about unbelievers when they write the date, the English style date, it's actually based on the Christian system, so they're acting as Christians when they do that. And then we got to talking about the Hebrew calendar, so I just think that's kind of interesting. That's what they use for the Hebrew calendar. So we'll pick up where we left off last time, and if you recall, we are talking about all the sources that we have that mention the resurrection of Jesus in one way or another. And we're going through each of these, we're qualifying these different sources based upon a simple question. We ask the question, can this source provide independent testimony to the resurrection of Jesus? In other words, is it not just a third-hand, fourth-hand, fifth-hand account, but is it an independent testimony that we can offer for the resurrection? We've gone through all of these. We've got two left, and these fall under the non-Christian sources, and so we'll cover those two and then we'll move on from there. So the first one we want to cover is Josephus. Most of you have probably heard of Josephus. He was a Jewish man that was born to a very popular, very famous priest in Jerusalem named Matthias. And so the interesting thing about Josephus, he was born in 37 AD, so just right after the resurrection. Christianity, he's in the same town that Christianity is starting out in Jerusalem. All the talk that's going on between Jews and Christians at the time, and his dad is a real high-ranking priest in the Jewish religion, and so you know that no doubt they talked about Christianity quite a bit in his house when he was growing up. But he's a devout Jew. He doesn't necessarily like Christians. He doesn't absolutely hate them, but he doesn't like them. He doesn't write favorably about them. He becomes a historian, and he writes about the Jewish people. His greatest work in Jewish history is called The Antiquities of the Jews. He later becomes a part of Roman government as a court reporter for the Romans. So there's some interesting things about him. There's some importance that he has. He's independent from Christianity. That means he's not biased toward Christianity. So that's good. So when we start talking about bias and, our own thoughts and our own desires and all that, he's certainly not Christian. He's Jewish. So that's a good thing that he's independent of Christianity. The second thing is his location and time in history are ideal. He's right in Jerusalem. He's involved with the Jewish religion. He's involved with Christianity that's sprung up. And he's also a historian, so he has a mind that's tuned into the affairs that are going on in the world. But there's some problems with Josephus' writing as well. And the first problem, there's several, but one of the first problems is there's no early manuscript. And you remember we always say earlier is better. Closer to the event is always more accurate. It's always better. The earliest copy we have of Josephus' writings of the Antiquity of the Jews is a copy from 1463. And so that's a rather late copy. And so there's a bit of a problem there. Another problem that's related to it, is there's uncertain authenticity, and that ties into there being no early manuscript. We'll talk more about this in a minute. But at this point, we can just say that because of this, we'll rank Josephus as just being possible for providing independent testimony to the resurrection. And so we move on to the last one on our list, and that's Tacitus. Cornelius Tacitus was a Roman historian, perhaps the greatest Roman historian. He wrote several biographies of of Roman rulers, including Nero, and so he wrote several things. He was scholars are very complimentary of Tacitus for his diligence in doing history. that he was very thorough, and so he's a good source as far as histories go. Likewise, he's independent of Christianity. He's a Roman. He's pagan. He doesn't lean toward Christianity, or nor is he Jewish. But another benefit is he has access to government records, because he became proconsul of Asia, and so he's actually in the Roman government. Proconsul is kind of like a governor, so to speak. And so he's got access to government records, so that's good that he has those. His writing that we see where he mentions Jesus is called the Annals, and it was written in 116 to 117 AD. So here again we're further away from the resurrection, and so the dating is a little bit problematic because it's further away, than we would like for it to be. The other thing is that he uses some unknown sources, and this becomes a bit of a problem, and we'll talk about this some more in a minute as well. But in all history, if you can't determine what sources they used, then there becomes some questions around how authentic it is and whether we can believe it or not. But for now, we can say that some argue that Tacitus's writing shows some signs of being tampered with, just like Josephus's writings. Josephus is even more so than Tacitus, but there's been some tampering that's been done, and we'll look at that shortly as well. But it's questionable whether Tacitus had contact with any of the apostles, or any of the eyewitnesses. So he's not relaying first-hand information. He's not an eyewitness himself. Where Josephus, talked with and was in the same city with several of the apostles, so he was a close associate, or he had association with apostles. Cornelius Tacitus doesn't have that connection, so that's a little problematic as well. But we'll still rank him as possible. And so that's all our sources. Now you remember we had several on there that we just kind of discounted. You remember we marked them in pink and we moved them off. We said, these aren't good primary sources for the resurrection, and so we moved those off. And so this is what we ended up with. But even what we ended up with, we still wish we had more, right? So some of the things that we wish we had that would be nice, it'd be nice to have a letter written by Jesus. How great would that be? That would be wonderful to have a letter written by him. It'd be nice to have some of Saul's material pre-conversion. And this would help us understand why Saul hated Christians so bad. What was the root of that? And we'll see how that plays into our different theories of the resurrection on down the line in 2 or 3 more weeks. But that would be very valuable information if we had some writings from Saul pre-conversion. There's no material from the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin is the Jewish governing body. You remember it was the Sanhedrin that Jesus was taken before when he was arrested. In morning when the sun came up, he had already been to the house of Annas, and he had been to the house of Caiaphas, and then he's taken before the Sanhedrin at sunup. It's before the Sanhedrin that Peter is also taken, in Acts. Early in the history of the church, they appear before the Sanhedrin as well. Stephen appears before the Sanhedrin, and so they're the governing body, so to speak, for the Jewish government. We'd like to have some Roman government documents that mention Jesus, something that was written by some Roman court clerk, or some Roman official, that we had some government documents that mention Jesus. And so we wish we had those things, but we don't. But that doesn't mean what we have is weak. Because what we do have is eyewitness accounts, and we've got multiple eyewitness accounts. We talked about, and we've talked several times about this independent testimony. How many sources of independent testimony do we have? And we have several. We have the apostles, we have Peter, we have the testimony of the women that first went to the tomb. We have Thomas looking at the wounds in Jesus' hands, in his wrist, and in his side. Then we have the eyewitness account of Paul. that Jesus appeared to him. We have the oral traditions. We talked about those oral traditions, the kerygma, as the Hebrews call it. But we have those oral traditions that are sprinkled throughout the gospel accounts and throughout all of the New Testament. We have the apostolic preaching. And so we have lots of early eyewitness accounts. And that's the second part. We have early accounts. We talk about the 1 Corinthians 15, that oral tradition that we see embedded in those 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7 especially. There's an oral tradition there that goes back to within months of the actual crucifixion, so we have early accounts. We also have accounts in the Gospels that are within 25 to 30 years of the event, and so that's not so far removed either that it's a problem, but we have very good early accounts. Multiple testimony. And that multiple testimony comes from those several eyewitnesses, but we also have multiple testimony from those outside of Christianity. And the testimony of Josephus and Tacitus. And so we have multiple lines of testimony. We also have hostile testimony in the form of Paul. Paul was hostile to Christianity, and he testifies to the resurrection of Jesus. And we also can consider Josephus to some extent to be hostile, since he's Jewish and he's certainly against the Christians. So that is part of what we have. We also have the early writings and the oral formulas, to mention that again because it is so incredibly important. We have those early writings of Paul and the oral tradition in the Gospels and in his epistles that appear. We have Clement and Polycarp. We have Clement and Polycarp that also tell us about the resurrection. They're also a source of the resurrection. We have the historical speeches that are in Acts that Luke wrote. And there's 3 different very important resurrection accounts that are in the book of Acts. We have those as well. And we have the oral tradition that's bedded in the historical letter to the church at Corinth. But remember, we also have oral traditions that we saw in Romans 1, 3, and 4. And we also saw the oral tradition that's embedded in Luke that speaks to the resurrection as well. So that's what we have. That's the sources that we've been through. Now, what we're going to do with those sources, as the historians that we are, remember we're looking at this from a purely historical perspective, and so as historians we now have our sources out there. We've now qualified them. We've taken those that don't quite meet our criteria, and we've set those off to the side, and now we have our core primary sources, and we have those in front of us. It's like our stack of books when you're writing your research paper. This is what I'm going to write on, and now we've got those. And so I'll go back and remind you of our roadmap that we discussed. We evaluate and rank the historical documents that mention Jesus from our list. You mentioned Jesus and the resurrection, and so we've done that now. And so our next step is we're going to establish the minimum historical bedrock facts. And we'll go ahead and say now that's the next step, but where we're headed is we're going to use that information to construct a comparative model, so that we can compare different resurrection theories. There's a whole bunch of theories out there, and we want to compare them, including the Christian resurrection narrative, and we want to compare all of those together based on a particular set criteria, and then historically we want to look which one matches up best compared to the biblical, bedrock facts. And so that's where we're headed. So this next step is to establish the minimum bedrock facts. The minimum bedrock facts are very important to our study. The resurrection scholar William Lane Craig, has said that the problem with all these other resurrection stories is that they fail to provide an explanation, a complete and comprehensive explanation of all the data and all the facts that surround the resurrection. They won't account for it. There's this base set of historical facts, and a lot of the naturalistic theories don't address those, and that's the greatest failure of these other accounts, of these other theories of the resurrection. I know I'd mentioned Gary Habermas before. He's probably the premier resurrection expert that we have at the time. Michael Licona is his protege, who's taken a lot of Habermas's work and data and has actually built this model that we're using and that we're studying. Comes from Gary Habermas's work and Licona's work especially. But Gary Habermas is an older gentleman. He's taught Bible and studied the resurrection for years and years and years. He's had the opportunity to interview over 100 different scholars, ranging from hardcore atheist all the way through the ardent, Christian. All of these people these scholars that are interested in the resurrection. He's interviewed a broad range of these. He's collected over 3,400 sources on many topics in the Bible. And after all of that data, and when he sifts through all that, he says that there is a baseline or a minimal bedrock facts that can be stated about the resurrection. And these are facts that are so strongly evidenced that the historian can fairly regard them as historical fact. And the majority of contemporary scholars regard them as historical facts. That's the minimum bedrock facts. These are things that you say to the atheist and they go, yeah, I've got to believe in that. These are facts, historical facts around the resurrection that almost all scholars agree upon. And that's what we're going to do, is sift through and find those bedrock facts that we can use, and that will be what we ultimately judge all of these resurrection theories against. How well do these theories answer these historical facts? How do they speak to these facts? And that's what we're headed toward. So quickly, the historical bedrock facts that we end up with are this: Jesus died by crucifixion. That's a historical bedrock fact that almost all scholars agree to. Even the hardcore atheists go, yeah, there was a man named Jesus, and Jesus died by crucifixion. And so that is a bedrock historical fact that's agreed upon by a wide range of scholars. The second bedrock fact is that very shortly after Jesus' death, the disciples had experiences that led them to believe and to proclaim that Jesus had been resurrected from the dead. So that's the second fact. All scholars believe that the apostles thought they saw Jesus. And so that becomes a historical bedrock fact. The third fact is, within a few years of Jesus' death, Paul converted after what he interpreted was an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. And there again, all the scholars agree that this is a fact. And so that becomes our three bedrock minimal facts. Those are here if you... My stickers are coming off. Those are here if you want to refer to those at any time. So Habermas lists several others, but Licona narrows them down to these three for two reasons. One, for simplicity, and two is some of the other ones he doesn't feel like there's enough scholars that back it up. And so the minimum comes down to these three. And so I'll go back to our roadmap again. We're going to establish the minimum bedrock facts. That's the three that we have, but we've still got some more work to do. Don't just take my word for it. We're going to look and see why are these bedrock facts and how we come up with those. Then we'll move on from there. So the first one we're going to look at, as we said, is Jesus died by crucifixion. And what should we say? Says who, right? That's what the historian says. Says who? Well, it turns out we have four sources that say that Jesus died by crucifixion. These are non-canonical or non-biblical sources. We have Josephus, that says that Jesus died by crucifixion. We have Tacitus, and we had just talked about those two, and they're in our list. And so we have those two. But we also have Lucian. Of Jesus' death by crucifixion. And also Serapion is another one that we took off of our list, and he as well speaks to the resurrection. Excuse me. And so as we said in the reminder, we're not looking at inspired sources. We're just looking at documents as historical documents. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it is lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many Jews and many Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous, and many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, and those who had become his disciples didn't abandon his discipleship. They reported that he appeared to them 3 days after the crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets had recounted wonders. So you see how plain that is compared to the first one? Statements like, if it's lawful to call him a man, that were in the first one, or he was the Christ, doesn't sound like something that would come from a Jew that was anti-Christian, that wrote against the Christians. And so there's some belief that this has been interpolated or changed. The Arabic version is a lot more accurate. But in either case, what we are looking for is testimony that Jesus was crucified. And in both cases, that fact remains. It's unchanged. That's two sources that say that Jesus was crucified. We can also look at Tacitus, and we just talked about him shortly ago. Tacitus wrote about a fire that had broke out in Rome in 64 AD under Nero. Now the story is that Nero set the fire himself. And so Nero was trying to get the heat off of him, so to speak, and was trying to blame it on someone else. And so he turned the blame toward the Christians to take the heat off of himself for setting the fire. But this is what Tacitus records about Jesus. He says, consequently, to get rid of the report, in other words, that he had set the fire, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite torture on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, for whom the name has its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So see, that's written very negative. he's bashing the Christians, but notice what he says. Suffered the extreme penalty. So that's good. You've got an independent witness that's hostile to Christianity, that doesn't like Christianity, but yet he writes that Jesus died by crucifixion. So that's a very good piece of information that we have. We also have a writing from Lucian. We said that we had taken him off of our list, but he's a non-Christian source. And he's not, he wasn't on our list. We'd taken him off, but he does speak to Jesus' death. And Lucian says, the Christians worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. It was impressed upon them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they were converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. You see, it says nothing about his resurrection. And so he's not an independent testimony to the resurrection. But we can use this to say he was crucified. So there's another point. There's another source of information that says, yes, that Jesus was crucified. And our last one is Marbar Serapion. And Serapion was a Stoic philosopher that was arrested kind of during the turmoil of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, or shortly after that. He was arrested in 73 AD. And when he was in prison waiting execution, he wrote a letter to his son, and this is what he wrote in this letter to his son. What advantage did the Athenians gain by murdering Socrates? Famine and plague came upon them as a punishment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these three wise men. The Athenians died of hunger. The Samians were overthrown by the sea. And the Jews, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, live in complete dispersion. But here again, executing their wise king. See, this is incredible. These are ancient writings. You know, these are non-Christians. These are people that are just writing histories. This is a personal letter to his son before he dies, before he's executed. And they're mentioning things like the death of Jesus. But that's not all that we have. We also have the canonical Gospels that speak of Jesus dying by crucifixion. We have it in the letters of Paul. And those are sources that we've already gone through and screened. We also have it in 1 Corinthians and in Galatians, both early events and early writings that are close to the event. We also have the Kerygma, the oral tradition again, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. We have the oral tradition in Romans 1, and we have the one in Luke as well. We also have supporting evidence in the negative sense that there's no contradictory evidence. There's nothing written anywhere that says, no, Jesus was not crucified. Or no, Jesus was punished and let go. There's nothing in existence that says that. The last is a very low probability of surviving the crucifixion. I did a study on this. There's actually in history, there's been 3 people, I think, total that have survived crucifixion. And I say survived, they lived for a little while, and 2 of them died. But one of them, actually, they took him down early enough to where he survived. But it's very unlikely to survive a crucifixion, especially, the Romans were very good at killing. So in summary, we can say that the historical evidence is very strong that Jesus died by crucifixion. The event is multiply attested by a number of ancient sources, some of which are non-Christian and thus not biased toward Christian interpretations of events. They appear in multiple literary forms, being found in the annals, historiographs, biographies, letters, and tradition in the form of oral formulas and hymns. Some reports are very early and are reasonably traced to the Jerusalem apostles, eyewitnesses. Finally, the probability of surviving the crucifixion is very low. And all that points to that Jesus died by crucifixion. There's more. If we were going to do a real in-depth study, we could study more about this and look more deeply at it. But this is as far as we need to go for this class. And we say, yes, that's a historical bedrock fact. All the scholars agree upon. That's why they agree upon it. Jesus died by crucifixion. So we move on to the second one, and we say very shortly after Jesus' death, the disciples had experiences that led them to believe and proclaim that Jesus had been resurrected and appeared to them. And so we want to move into that. And so we have supporting information for this. We have sources, and the first source, of course, is 1 Corinthians, that 15, 3 through 8. Paul lays out the people that Jesus appears to. I won't say all the people, but he appears to those people that are listed there, we know for sure. He also appeared to the women, but they're not listed in this early tradition. There's some reasons. There's some reasons that it's believed why they didn't. But 1 Corinthians is just really a wonderful passage. This is the oldest manuscript of 1 Corinthians 15 that we have, and it's dated around the year 150. Now, some of the original papyruses they project could last as long as 100 years. So it's very likely that this we have in our possession could be a second or third copy is all. Very, very close to the original 1 Corinthians 15. And so this is a very, very old source. And what it says, we'll read it once again. If you want to follow in your Bibles, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. And listen to these. We're talking about the disciples claiming that he appeared to them. That's the claim that they're making. That's the bedrock fact that we're looking at. And here Paul says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to the apostles, and last of all, as the one untimely born, he appeared also to me." So all of that, except for the first sentence and the last sentence, are part of that oral tradition. That's Paul's own words in the beginning. Remember, he said, "Hey, I'm fixing to tell you an oral tradition. I'm going to deliver to you what I also received." And then the last sentence, he adds that he appeared to me also. But that's the oral tradition, and that's our strongest source. It's very early, and it comes from eyewitness testimony. The second one is an interesting one to think about, and it's the women witnesses. Now, these are not the apostles, but the women also believed that Jesus appeared to them. And they were associated with the apostles. Women as the first eyewitnesses at the empty tomb has a strong sense of history to it, a strong sense of being true for a couple of reasons. The first reason, and you may have heard of this, is that in Mediterranean society, unfortunately, women had a very low standing. Jesus changed a lot of this. That's why a lot of his teaching was so countercultural, because he was trying to elevate and lift women up to the equality of men where they should be, and so it was countercultural. But in the Mediterranean society, they just didn't have those thoughts. This is Josephus again, and this is what Josephus wrote about women testimony, or a woman giving testimony in his Antiquities. "But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex, since it is probable that they may not speak truth either out of hope of gain or fear of punishment." So that's what Josephus says about testimony of women. But the Jewish Talmud, that's the Jewish book of the civil law, also speaks of women, and it says, any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer. This is equivalent to saying that one who is rabbinically accounted a robber is qualified to give the same evidence as a woman. So see, their attitude was just, not in all cases, but in a lot of cases was not where it should be. And I won't quote, but the Quran also says that the testimony of women is not acceptable. The Quran speaks rather negatively and rather harshly about that as well. But this is good for our study. It's bad for women at that time, but this is good for our study because of the embarrassment factor. If the women's testimony is thought of in that way, it's embarrassing that women were the first witnesses, right? I mean, where were the men? Hiding. And so women were the first to testify. They were the first to give testimony. That's embarrassing. It's an embarrassing story for Christians. We're trying to get our new movement started, and it's embarrassing that women actually discovered the tomb. And so that's an embarrassment factor. The second embarrassment factor is that it does raise the question, where were the disciples? Where were the apostles? Well, they were hiding. So that's another embarrassment factor. If the story was made up in the Gospels, they wouldn't put those aspects in there because of the viewpoint of women testimony and of the disciples being hiding out, being scared. That's one thing that authenticates these stories is because of this embarrassment factor, and it's very, very high that it's not a false story. Another reason is the apostles' fate, and we talk about that, and we say, one reason that we know that the apostles really truly believed that Jesus appeared to them is because they were martyred, and that was their faith. And if we go through and we look at Clement, tells us that First Clement 5, 2 through 7, and remember we use Clement as a possible source. But Clement says, because of envy and jealousy, the greatest and most righteous pillars have been persecuted and condemned unto death. Let us set the good apostles before our eyes. Peter, who because of unrighteousness, envy, not once or twice, but endured many afflictions, and having bore witness, went to the due glorious place. That talks of Peter's martyrdom. A little further down, because of rivalries and the steadfast Paul was pointed to the prize, 7 times chained, exile, stoned, becoming a preacher both in the east and the west, received the honor fitting of his faith. And so there is First Clement writing of the martyrdom of the apostles. Polycarp also writes of the death of the apostles and that they were martyred for their belief. So in summary, we can say that very shortly after Jesus' death, the disciples did have experiences that led them to believe that and proclaim that Jesus had been raised from the dead. So we have all sorts of sources that say that. And so that becomes our second bedrock fact. The third fact is within a few years of Jesus' death, Paul converted after what he interpreted to be a post-resurrection appearance to him. And so we have different sources that tell us that Paul had this experience, that Paul was converted. And so some of those sources, one of those sources is Paul's testimony in his own letters. Letters that we know that Paul wrote. He's testifying about himself and what happened to him. There's 3 different accounts in Acts. There's also in the letters of Paul that Paul writes, Luke mentions them. The believers in Judea, if you recall that, in Galatians 1:23, he talks about the believers in Judea that they did not personally know me. They only had a report that the man who formerly persecuted us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. So that's another piece of evidence from the believers in Judea. There it is. I didn't realize it was on my screen. And we have Paul's martyrdom. And we speak to that testimony of a man will die for something he believes to be true, but a man will never die for something he knows to be false. It just doesn't happen. And so Paul truly believed that Jesus had appeared to him on the road and that he was converted. If you Google the martyrdom of the apostles, usually what you come up with is a list like this. This is typically what we see. James was death by sword. Peter crucified. I won't go through all of them, but martyred in Syria, beaten to death, crucified, died, beheaded. So we go through and you see that. We were led to believe that. We were taught that, a lot of us growing up, that all the apostles were martyred. But here it's important when we're looking at things from a historical perspective to make sure that we are accurate in our history. There's a professor named Sean McDowell. Y'all may have heard of Josh McDowell. That's his dad. But Sean McDowell did his PhD work on the martyrdom of the apostles. And through all his research, he came up with this. This is historically based. He used the Gospels and all different sources he could find. And the highest possible probability that Peter and Paul and James, the brother of John, were martyred for their faith. Only those three had the very highest possible probability that they were crucified. Most of them it's as plausible as not. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't, but we can't say for sure. John is improbable that he died for his faith. But remember, in history, we can't say absolutely for certain, beyond all shadow of a doubt, that anything happened. So the highest category you can get is the highest possible probability. But here's the good thing. Peter and Paul and James, there's three apostles that were martyred, absolutely, certainly martyred for their faith. James, the brother of Jesus, was also run through with a spear. It is very highly likely that he died. Thomas as well. And so we have several there that did. And again, a person will die for a lie if they think that it's the truth, but nobody dies for a lie that they know it's a lie. So they very much believed that Jesus had appeared to them. I guess the bell rang and I need to cut off for here, so we'll pick up at this point again next Sunday. Thank y'all for your attention. If you have any questions, let me know.